What does Alfred Hitchcock have to do with acoustics research? Probably nothing, but we're going to talk about him anyway. Hello and welcome to The Rest is Just Noise, a podcast all about the science, beauty, and noise of our cities. Today we're joined by Dr. Ellie Ratcliffe, self-proclaimed Queen of the Birds, and an environmental psychologist at the University of Surrey. We'll be talking to her about her recent paper, Predicting the Perceived Restorative Potential of Bird Sounds Through Acoustics and Aesthetics. In it, Ellie's team investigates the restorative potential of 50 different bird sounds and how their acoustic properties influence our perception of birds and natural environments. The rest is just noise. Thank you very much, Ellie, for joining us.
Thank you, Ellie.
How are you doing today, now that we've finally gotten things sorted out?
Yeah, I'm doing very well, thank you. It's nice to talk to you.
Yeah, it's great. Thanks for coming on. So I wanted to go ahead and start out our conversation. We're going to go through a lot of things, but I want to start with just a sort of general question that we plan to ask everyone, which is that we all come into the field of working in sound and acoustics in different ways, and we all seem to take a different path. So I just wanted to ask how you came into it. What was the path you sort of took, and how did you get interested in it?
Gosh, well, I'm a psychologist by training, so I did my undergraduate degree and my master's in psychology. But during that, I got really interested in environmental psychology and specifically restorative environments. So how different places and spaces can help people to recover and to feel better after everyday stress and fatigue. And I was looking to do a PhD roughly in that area, but I didn't know exactly what. I was just trying to kind of wait for an idea to come. And then I read an opinion piece in The Guardian, which was talking about how birdsong could help people in the darkest times of winter to kind of lift their mood. And I thought, this makes a really interesting research question, because at that time, I don't think there was a whole lot of research on nature sounds and well-being. So that's kind of how I got into it, a bit by accident, really.
So you started out at undergrad studying psychology originally, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
the take-home message is basically reading newspapers can change a life. That's
Yeah, totally. And we
remember, kids, yes,
read widely, don't we? But I don't know. I was really lucky. I had at that time a master supervisor he works at Goldsmiths, and he was very much about just approaching people if you had an idea and saying, "Hey, do you want to collaborate on this?" So that's what I did with the birdsong idea, really, and got a really nice group of people together for supervision and funding and all that. So yeah, kind of just taking opportunities.
And I think we should go deeper with restoration. Andrew, what do you think?
Yeah, because you mentioned restorative environments and helping people sort of recover from stress. So what do we sort of mean by that? What exactly do we mean by restorativeness?
Well, if you think about being in a psychological state where maybe you're depleted, so for example, at the end of a long work week where you spent a lot of time focusing on a task, or maybe you've had some kind of everyday stress and strain, like an argument, or you're feeling a bit run down in general. That leaves you in a depleted, negative state where you might want to be restored from that. And certain environments, it's proposed, they have certain properties that can help people to regain that recover their attentional and their affective resources. So that's really the field of restorative environments, and it's very much kind of everyday recovery.
Do we know how that sort of works? Like what mechanism there is that ends up bringing you back from that sort of negative space?
Well, there are a couple of theories. Neither of them are perfect, I must say. And I think there's a lot of discussion, a lot of change going on in the field at the moment about how effective these theories really are. One of them is an information processing kind of theory, which suggests that different environments have certain properties, particularly those that are easy to process cognitively, and therefore they give your attention a chance to recover. And the other theory is a bit more psychoevolutionary and suggests that because humans are adapted to be in specifically natural environments, those are the places where we feel more relaxed, and particularly if there's resources around.
So do you think we could be in a restoration situation in non-natural environments then?
So restorative environments are restorative because they have restorative properties. And so there's work going on in the field to try and, improve and branch out from those theories.
Okay.
So the question then leads to, we're talking about these restorative environments. How it's quite a subjective thing, right? How do you determine whether someone is in like a negative psychological state and needs to be restored, and then how do you determine to what degree they like restore to a positive state? You know, how do we sort of measure this subjective thing of restorativeness?
The thing Andrew wants to ask, but he doesn't want to say it, is how do you measure? How do you measure restoration? But yeah, I'm saying that for him. So please.
Oh, good clarification. No, I mean it's a valid question, and I think a question a lot of people from outside environmental psychology wonder as well. I suppose there are two questions within that. One is, how do you know if people need restoration? And if you think about kind of your everyday life, you know in yourself if you're feeling a bit, it's been a really long week and I could do with, recharging or going to the pub or whatever it is that you do to feel better. Not that we can go to the pub anymore. But we have various ways of, in the laboratory, supposedly making people in a state of fatigue or stress, so giving them tasks that deplete their resources. And also we can measure how people are feeling effectively in their own self-report. So we can give them questionnaires and scales to say how happy versus unhappy are you, how relaxed versus stressed. We can also look at physiological measures. So people's heart rate, which increases if they're more stressed, their skin conductance, which does the same, their blood pressure, even measures like cortisol, which can be examined over a longer period of time as well. So you can measure people's baseline state and their need for restoration, and B, the extent to which they have recovered through an environmental intervention or exposure after that state of depleted attention or stress or whatever negative state it was. From my perspective, I'm a bit more interested in people's subjective experiences rather than kind of heart rate or physiological measures, because I'm quite interested in how people feel in their own words, which is why I do a lot of qualitative research on restoration as well.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, you've done some of this work on people's subjective restorativeness and how much they tell you they feel restored by a particular thing. And I want to dig into that and tie it back around to the bird sound, because we've looked at this recent paper of yours about predicting restorative potential of certain sounds. So which particular method did you use in this paper to measure people's degree of restoration?
Well, this was the paper you're talking about was a quantitative paper, although overall it was part of a mixed method study. So in this paper that was published fairly recently, there were participants completing an online survey, and they had to rate a number of different short clips of bird sound on how likely they would feel that bird sound would be restorative. So they imagined being in a psychological state of stress and fatigue, and then they said how much or to what extent listening to each sound would help them to recover from that state. A quantitative study with a subjective measure. And it wasn't just that item they were rating as the outcome. So there were other things like how happy versus unhappy they felt listening to the sound, how stressed versus calm, and also perceptions of how much the sound mapped onto different theoretical constructs of restoration as well. So there were a number of different quantitative outcomes.
And then what sort of acoustic properties were you looking at of the bird sound? Because that's sort of the other half of this, right? Is the bird sound
exactly. So if I maybe it helps if I kind of explain what the study was looking at as well. So I wanted to try and build a predictive model of what properties would predict how restorative people found all these different sounds. So some acoustic properties and also some more aesthetic, so subjective aesthetic perceptions about kind of how the sound was structured. And before I get into kind of how I measured those things, maybe if I say a bit about the rationale as well. Yeah. So before this study, I had done some interviews where I was asking people about their perceptions of nature sounds in general and then bird sounds and how that linked to restoration. And one of the really interesting things from those interviews was that not everyone perceived bird sounds in the same way, and there were variations between different types of bird sounds. So some people thought certain birds were really beautiful and nice and calming to listen to, And then some other bird sounds were kind of angry and stressful or not nice to listen to. And so that really led me onto the idea of, okay, there's a lot more variation in how we perceive bird sounds than maybe the literature suggests, because the literature just kind of bundles nature sounds together quite a lot of the time. And I was really interested to examine more of the nuance around that. So then that led to this kind of predictive modeling study. And I had all of these different bird sounds. And then I used some acoustic software to measure their sound level, so corresponding roughly to how loud or how quiet the sound was. The harmonicity, so how much the sound was harmonic versus noisy. The fundamental frequency of the sound, so that corresponds roughly to people's perception of pitch. So those were the acoustic properties. And then I was interested in also how people responded aesthetically or structurally to the sound, you might say. So how familiar versus unfamiliar they perceived, how simple or complex, and how random the sounds were versus how patterned. So those were the different kinds of properties I was looking at and putting into this model.
So you've got this sort of combination of like objectively measured aspects of the sound, as well as sort of perceptual aesthetic aspects of the sound. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And for something like familiarity, I did try and kind of cross the objective and the subjective. So I got people to rate how familiar or not familiar the sounds were. But also half of the sounds were, objectively speaking, unfamiliar because they came from Australia and all the participants were British. So half the birds were British birds and half were from Australia. Interestingly, although I guess we get to the results a bit later, kind of the objective familiarity, so where the birds were from, didn't come out as important in the analysis. It was the subjective familiarity that really mattered to people. But yeah, like you say, it was trying to kind of mix up the objective and the subjective predictors.
That also kind of comes back to what you were saying earlier about how people perceive different nature sounds differently, right? And they're not all just pleasant, right? So does that come down to like species level things? Is it that certain species of birds have pleasant bird songs and then certain species don't?
Well, I think that's one aspect to it. And with this study, because I could only use, a certain number of sounds to kind of make it manageable to do, I picked sound clips that were, let's say, broadly representative of how different birds sound. But, depending on the circumstances, a bird with the sweetest little song could also sound kind of aggressive or make a, little call that's not very interesting or something like that. So I guess I was trying to create a general picture and also use bird sounds as a lens to understand a bit more about positive perceptions of sounds. So I'm wary of trying to attach too much stigma to one species or another species, just from their acoustic properties. Yeah. But thinking about bird species, that relates more actually to the qualitative work that I've done. So asking people about the associations they have with different bird sounds. And there, very often participants would talk about, folklore from, say, they were from a different country, folk tales about different birds, or media that they remembered where there were these kind of stereotypes or sounds associated with different birds as well. So in this study, it was a lot more kind of, just the sounds that people were being presented with, and they weren't told what the species was. But the associations with species certainly came out in other aspects of the work, yeah.
So pigeons, where do we stand with pigeons?
Well, it's funny
that's very important to me. I mean, I have conflicting.
We are looking at Andrew and Ben.
Gosh, well, okay. Here's a really interesting example. So in this paper with the predictive model, like I say, no one was provided with the name of the species. They just heard the sounds. And sometimes people would hear the sound of, a common pigeon that you would see on the pavement, and they interpreted it as a different kind of sound. So they would say, when they were giving a qualitative response, which was part of the same study, they would say, "Oh, it reminds me of this dove in my grandmother's garden." And I was like, okay, this is just some feral pigeon that eats chips,
Nice.
But they interpreted it as something familiar and beautiful, and they had a nice association with it, and they responded accordingly. So if they associated it with something nice, then they tended also to to rate it positively.
So actually, each bird could create positive and unpleasant sounds, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in the study, I was just using one sound clip per bird, but sometimes people would hear a sound that was completely unremarkable, just a pigeon, and because of their own personal experiences, they would find some positive meaning and therefore positive evaluation in it.
I guess.
So for me, that's the value of looking at people's subjective responses. You get to dig a bit deeper and find out, what is the individual experience going on here.
Yeah, I guess it could be like with a cat. I mean, you like when it purrs, but you don't like when it hisses at you.
And yet we categorize this as cat noise.
Yeah.
But if we dig a bit deeper, we can see that there are variations there, and that's really what I wanted to look at. Like, what are the variations in nature sounds and bird sounds that we can find positive elements in, and also understand what people don't like and try and minimize that.
So that brings us back to this the study we were discussing. So you've got these a mix of acoustic and aesthetic characteristics of the bird sound, and then you've got people's online ratings of how they perceive those bird sounds. What sort of relationships were you able to pull out from comparing those?
Well, I found that certain acoustic properties were good predictors of how people felt the bird sounds to be restorative. So things like sound level, so corresponding to how loud or quiet the sound would be, that was a negative predictor. So people tended to prefer and find more restorative the bird sounds that were quieter.
Which is what we would typically expect, yeah.
Exactly. So this is not surprising. And particularly if even though it's kind of a hypothetical mental model, if you're asking people to imagine themselves when they're stressed or feeling a bit, subpar, you probably don't want lots of extra stimulation that's supplied by loud noises. So it makes sense that people would want quieter bird sounds. The bird sounds that had more harmonic properties, so they weren't kind of rough or noisy, they were also positive predictors. So people tended to prefer for restoration the bird sounds that sounded like quiet, sweet, melodic little songbirds. What else? Yeah, so the frequency as well. So higher pitched bird sounds were perceived to be more restorative. And one explanation for that could be is that they're generally made by smaller bird sounds, so not so threatening or aggressive. And that was kind of borne out in the qualitative work that I did as well. So the little songbirds that had quiet, sweet songs, people tended to perceive them as being, kind and gentle and not aggressive. So those were the main findings for the acoustic properties, kind of the direction of findings. I can talk a bit about the aesthetic properties as well. That also varied a little. Yeah,
that's the one that sort of, to me, seems really interesting about this study, because some of those acoustic ones, it kind of matches what we expect, right? So digging into how these aesthetic properties that are more difficult to sort of objectively capture is it's really interesting to look at how those interact with people's restorativeness and perception. So if you could dig into that some more, that would be really
I think that one I touched on before is familiarity, and so that was a positive predictor of how restorative people rated the bird sound. So if it was familiar, they perceived the sound as going to be more relaxing and better for restoration. And that also, at least from the standpoint of my work, makes sense, because if you're feeling stressed and a bit overwhelmed mentally, you probably want stimuli that are familiar to you, because they're not likely to be threatening. That's, also a kind of psychoevolutionary perspective. But from maybe a more kind of constructivist approach to environments as well, if something in the environment is familiar to you, maybe you have associations with it. And like I was saying, a lot of people had positive associations with bird sounds that they enjoyed recalling, and they kind of elaborated on and told stories about birds from their past. So it was an interesting finding for me to see that bore out in the predictive model as well. people responded positively to bird sounds that had this sense of complexity. So there was a lot going on in the sound clip, even though it was short. So if the bird sound had lots of notes, you might say, or sounded a bit musical. But also they responded positively to pattern. So patterned bird sounds rather than ones that seemed random or just had kind of scattered information. So if the bird sound had complexity that was presented in a structured and patterned way, those were the kind of bird sounds that people responded most positively to and perceived as being more restorative.
So is there any sort of theory for why this positive association with complexity? Because that seems kind of counterintuitive, that we typically think of like complexity not necessarily being restorative, as being, something that
tires the brain.
Exactly. So how does that sort of play into this idea of restorativeness of relaxing, of cognitive relaxing?
I think on a number of levels. So there's a lot of work from the field of environmental aesthetics this is stuff way back in the 60s and 70s, and it was mostly with visual stimuli, showing that people prefer complex stimuli in the environment up to a certain point, like you're saying. So maybe there's like a non-linear relationship. If something is too complex, then, like you say, people get a bit overstimulated and overwhelmed. And especially if you're already in a stressed or overstimulated state, maybe you don't want that. I think the thing with these bird sounds is that they're quite unlikely to be super complex. So you're probably already hitting a ceiling effect, that you're not going to, get the world's most complicated bird sound in a 10-second clip. So maybe that linear relationship with complexity is just because the sounds weren't super complex.
Can we also make sort of an analogy with music here, where like a particularly simplistic song, let's say Baby Shark or something, is definitely not restorative.
Oh, no.
just to put that into everybody's heads right now. But something with a bit more complexity in there, just sort of like hits that right degree of complexity to distract us enough and sort of and sort of allow us to relax.
Exactly. So maybe it's the idea of kind of the Goldilocks zone or the sweet spot. And this links to one of the theories, the attention restoration theory, which I mentioned earlier, is more this kind of information processing approach to restorative environments. And within that theory, it suggested that environments which offer a sense of interest or attentional capture that's not too extreme within the environment can aid restoration, because they give you an opportunity to effectively distract yourself from whatever is troubling you or taking up your mental resources. It's a little hard to kind of operationalize that and like, okay, exactly how do you define that optimum level of distraction, so to speak? But to me, this idea of complexity, particularly linked with patterns. So if you have complex stimuli that are presented in a patterned or structured way, the complexity is constrained necessarily by the level of pattern, the order in which the information is presented somehow. So to me, those two variables, pattern and complexity, they were quite important that they appeared together as positive predictors in the model.
And the last thing there was like the randomness of the signal. How did that is that what you're talking about with this pattern, or is there some sort of relationship with some sort of optimal degree of randomness?
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. It's hard to answer that question because the pattern was a subjectively measured variable. So we were asking people to rate on a bivariate scale, how random versus pattern do you find this sound? So I guess it's quite subjective. People would evaluate pattern based on, maybe if they felt that the bird was repeating sounds that it had made already, or if there was some kind of rhythm or, like you say, musicality to the sound as well. But that would be something that would be interesting to explore a bit more. And I'm aware of musicians and soundscape researchers who look at crossovers between birds and bird sounds and music, and even make music with birds as well. But yeah, for that one, because it was such a subjective measure, it's hard to define in terms of, information processing specifically.
rest is just noise. The rest is just noise. So, I just wanted to get into one last thing on this specific paper, which is that one of the key takeaways that I saw at the end of it is that there's these different relationships between cognitive responses, so people's response of like their fascination, and affective responses, their sort of arousal to the sounds. So what are those sort of different predictive relationships between the objective features of the sound, or the acoustic and aesthetic features of the sound, and those sort of different types of responses?
Well, it seemed to be that the acoustic properties more directly related to the affective appraisals, so particularly things like arousal. And if you're thinking of
just to clarify, what do we mean by arousal in that sort of context?
So the sense of psychological activation. So how excited or stressed versus calm someone feels when they're listening to this sound. That was in the context of this study. One of the tricky things about measuring arousal in psychology is it's very hard for people to give an indication of how aroused they feel without the mood or the valence attached to it, because we tend not to just think, ooh, I feel activated today. It tends to be, we feel excited, which has a positive mood or valence attached to it, or I feel stressed, which has you're activated, but in a negatively valence kind of way. But that's a long-winded way of saying arousal is the level of emotional activation that people were feeling. So where was I? So the acoustic sounds, or the acoustic properties of the sounds, tended to be more related or show kind of more patterns of prediction towards these affective outcomes like mood and arousal. Whereas the aesthetic properties, they were perhaps more directly or more clearly related to the kind of information processing and cognitive outcomes, particularly related to attention restoration theory, which taps these kind of different information processing properties. So in a way, it kind of links to theory, although the theories in this area have been quite driven by visual experience of environments. So sometimes it's hard to know directly how does this fit with the theoretical arguments.
Yeah, unfortunately, we always seem to be falling behind visual research, which...
Oh, I missed that. The sound is a little low.
Unfortunately, we do seem to fall behind visual research, which as a specifically sound guy, always kind of... it makes me sad.
I can see it, but I think the field of restorative environments itself has a long way to go still in terms of, I don't think the problem is with sound. I think the problem is maybe with the overall field of study in restorative environments, in that we focused on vision for so long, or kind of visuospatial experience, that the prevailing theories have neglected to integrate how people respond to environments in non-visual ways, which is really a shame. And it's one of the reasons I got into this field. It's like these theories are not inclusive. They don't seem to explain people's real world experience of environments apart from in a very general and broad way. And so in this study, I kind of wanted to make this predictive model to chip away at that a bit and show, okay, there are parallels of the visual environment, so things like the aesthetic properties of sounds, like complexity and pattern. We can measure those and we can show how they relate to at least perceived restorativeness, and then kind of add strength to the argument that we need to greater develop and expand the theories we use in order to take account of these different environmental experiences.
How good were these predictive models? What sort of accuracy are you getting out? How close are you able to actually predict groups of people's perceptions versus like an individual person?
So in the predictive model, it was based not on the results from individual people, but actually averaging results across people per bird sound. So the model was made up of thinking of the birds as the participants, if you like, and then using that to create a model. And the overall kind of explanatory power of the model, or how much variance in scores it explained for overall perceived restorative value was quite good, so around 70% of the variance in the score. The predictive value of the model was a lot lower actually for arousal and valence, so around 30%. And one of the reasons I think that might be is because of the individual differences in people's associations with bird sounds. It might also be to do with just how well different acoustic properties of bird sounds explain things like arousal. Maybe it's also implicated by, I don't know, experiencing the birds in their own environment as opposed to just an isolated sound in the computer. Maybe it's a bit easier for people to make judgments about, I don't know, the information content rather than, you know, how stressed they feel. So certainly there are some limitations, I think, around asking people just to evaluate one sound and then trying to extrapolate from that one sound to broader generalizations. But in things like kind of the information processing, the explanatory ability of the model was fairly good.
So what's the final sort of question on this sort of thing is what's the next step? Where do you hope to go from this sort of predictive model, or how do you hope that it will actually be implemented and used?
That's a really interesting question, because for me, this work was completed quite a few years ago. And after that, I moved actually away from birds, which is funny because I still trade on being, you know, the bird person.
Queen of the birds.
You're still the queen. You're still the queen.
I'm still the queen.
That's for life.
Haven't been deposed
excuse
yet.
me, my subjects still need to hear from me. I guess for me, the value in this work has been opening up restorative environments a bit to thinking about how we can include sound in theory a bit more. So the theoretical development aspect of it has been quite interesting to me. I've had a lot of really good conversations with colleagues about how to develop and progress theory based on this work. I think also, and it's funny because this is not directly part of this paper that we are talking about. It's part of the qualitative paper that went alongside it. It's understanding individual people's experiences of, say, sounds in nature as a case study, but maybe also other aspects of nature and other aspects of environment in general. Understanding how individual people construct their experience based on their memories, their associations. And so like that key finding for me in this paper is really about familiarity. So regardless of the objective experience of the stimulus you're having, like two people could hear the same sound. And if one person perceived it as a sound that they were familiar with, they responded really well. And then one person perceived it as unfamiliar, they responded completely differently. Objectively, the experience was the same, but people were perceiving and responding to it totally differently.
It's all the sort of personal and historical, like personal history factors that we bring in before we actually interpret
I have a comment
the
about
sound.
that. I think the key factor is whether people have actually watched the movie by Hitchcock. I mean,
Well, there's the
after
question.
watching that
Ellie,
movie-
have you watched the movie?
Yeah, have you?
I have, and actually in one of my studies, a participant started talking about like, how they didn't like certain species of birds, and they started talking about the Hitchcock movie. They weren't the only person. A lot of people were talking about references to movie, media. I actually gave a whole conference presentation on the owls are not what they seem, because that's what someone wrote about, the owls, and they referenced Twin Peaks.
Twin Peaks,
So-
I just wanted to...
Yeah, this is all related to the same topic in that, for me, the most interesting finding out of all of this work was the individual variation in how people respond to sounds. And so then I took that work forward, looking not just at sounds, but at wider places. And I started to make links between place attachment and place memory and restorative environment. So that's the work I went on to do afterwards.
My suggestion for your next paper is have a control group which doesn't watch the birds beforehand, and then a control group which does.
I mean, after watching the movie,
Yeah.
try walking on Brighton and Hove seaside, holding a sandwich, and all the seagulls looking at you. And I mean, it's crazy.
Oh, that sounds scary. I'm not sure I
Yeah,
want
it's,
Yeah.
I think Francesco's talking from personal experience there.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah. Any in three-eyed ravens or that source.
that kind of stuff. Yeah.
No, but
Now this is starting to sound a bit like a therapy session.
to me, the key message is that when only listening to sounds, like all pigeons are actually white doves.
It's funny because when was it? Maybe about a year after I finished this work. So all of this work on birds was my PhD thesis, and not long after that, I went to give a talk to the British Trust for Ornithology, which is a bird conservation charity. And a lady after the talk, she approached me and she said, this country has a real image problem with seagulls. And she felt that it was kind of an unfair image problem. I mean, the seagulls are just trying to, live their bird lives. But people don't like them because they perceive them as aggressive and stealing your sandwich on the beach or nicking the ice cream out of a baby's hand and all this kind of thing. And we were talking about how people kind of apply these narratives or these meanings to bird sounds based on their experiences, and then whether it's possible to change people's perceptions of a bird or a sound if you try to change and shift the narrative. And so one of the questions you asked me is kind of how might I see this work applied? And obviously you way nature sounds, and sometimes people ask me, could you create the perfect bird sound? And I guess you could artificially, but it wouldn't be real. But maybe the value of this work is in trying to better understand the associations and the existing perceptions that people have with nature sounds. And if they are negative and that's causing them to feel disconnected to their environment, maybe there's a way to take some positive associations they have and magnify them and use that as a tool to create better engagement with the natural world.
Yeah, I think that's a great goal. We should always be more engaged with the natural world, particularly those of us who live almost entirely in cities at the moment. It's tough to get that sort of connection.
And I know that's a focus of your podcast as well. And it particularly in this kind of era where we spend now a lot of time indoors in our homes, and we spent a lot of time indoors anyway, even pre-pandemic. But ways in which I think people could try and get little micro experiences of the outdoor world, or find something in the environment that they can perceive as beautiful, perceive as positive, and connect to. I think that can be a really great entry point into, just feeling more connected to the world in general.
Yeah, that's another that's part of the issue in cities is even if the birds are here, and are living in the cities and are out there singing their hearts out, if we can't actually ever hear the sound, if it's masked by traffic noise, or by by loading noises from trucks and all that sort of stuff, then we never get the impact of that. So there's that important thing of, even if the birds are there, we need to be able to hear them in order to get these sort of restorative effects.
Yeah, definitely. And I know, we touched on this earlier maybe, but people have been commenting on how difficult it is for the sounds of the natural world to kind of break through the sounds of the urban environment. But then also when we maybe saw a reduction in urban noise, traffic pollution, all of these kinds of things, nature and wildlife kind of came out to play a bit more. And I don't know if it's just anecdotal, but I seem to see a lot more squirrels and foxes around me these days, or maybe it's just because I'm at home more and I notice them. I don't know. But I think there's certainly work that we should be doing in trying to ensure that not just, our visual natural environment is supportive of biodiversity and wildlife, but also the acoustic environment. That seems sensible.
I think I've read recently a paper published in Science, I think, about songbirds reclaiming favorite frequencies because of the reductions in traffic noise level. So something like this lockdown basically led to levels not seen in half a century, and basically led to a shift in song frequency in white-crowned sparrows, I think was the species.
Interesting.
And this shift was basically notable because of the frequency of human-produced traffic noise, which typically occurs in a range that is interfering with their highest performance and most effective song. So basically, by lowering those levels, they were able to sing more effectively. And yeah, probably from a reproduction perspective, it was better, I guess. Yeah, so it was great. Let's go out and have fun. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, that's something we should consider. I mean, also for the future. Like, I hope there will be no future pandemics like this. But yeah.
There's always a silver lining, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was specifically in the San Francisco Bay Area, and yeah, it was the white-crowned sparrow.
Yeah.
Which hopefully their bird song matches all of these nice things that you found in your study.
I hope. I don't know offhand about that bird, but yeah, I mean, I when I was doing this research, I used to be a lot better at identifying birds. My skills have disappeared somewhat, let's say.
Well, I think that was a fantastic little dive into all the sort of these acoustic features of birdsong, how they impact our restorativeness. So, Ellie, I guess the sort of last question is there any sort of key thing that you would like our listeners to go away with when they're thinking about bird sounds and natural sounds in their environments?
Gosh, I guess really just try to listen. I think listening is a skill that we don't seem to practice very much. We're all very fond of talking, but not many people are so fond of listening. Maybe that sounds a bit, I don't know, boring to emphasize, but I think it's important. And particularly when you're outdoors, people are just quite busy trying to get from A to B, or we're outdoors and we're thinking about what's on our phone. So maybe it's good to just actually focus on what is in the environment around you and what you actually hear, and the things that you would normally perceive as background noise, like birds. Maybe just try to focus on them and really hear what is going on out there, and then what you associate with that, and find something that you think is beautiful, and then you can remember it and go back to it at other times in your life.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
If anybody else would like to find you, are there any places that they can find you on Twitter or anything like that?
Yes, I'm on Twitter. My username is LEL_Ratcliffe. Or if you search for Eleanor or Ellie Ratcliffe on Google, you'll find my research pages as well.
Brilliant. All right. Well, thanks very much, Ellie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everything worked out well. That's
We'll have to see how the editing process. The rest is just noise.
That was great.
Noise.
Noise.
Noise is
Just noise.
Just noise. The rest is just noise.
You can find episodes of The Rest is Just Noise on all of your usual podcast apps.
And on our website at justnoisepod.com. We're also on Twitter as @justnoisepod.
The Rest is Just Noise is supported by the UK Acoustics Network.